It began with a song, not on a battlefield, but behind barbed wire in the middle of America. It was 1944. The world was still burning, soldiers were still dying, and Europe was still echoing with the sounds of war. Yet, far from the chaos, in the quiet plains of Kansas, a strange harmony rose from a prisoner of war camp filled with captured German soldiers. They weren't shouting, drilling, or defying orders. They were singing. The words were American. The voices were German. The melody, Home on the Range. Guards paused. Locals nearby stopped their cars along the dusty road. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. Enemy soldiers singing the very songs of the country that had captured them. Inside the fences of Camp Concordia, something unusual was unfolding. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't rebellion. It was understanding. Men who had fought under the Nazi flag now found themselves learning English from American folk songs. They studied lyrics about freedom and open skies, ideas that had been forbidden in their homeland. And slowly they began to sing them not as prisoners, but as men rediscovering their humanity. This wasn't an isolated moment of peace in a time of global war. It was part of a quiet experiment taking place across the United States, an experiment in re-education, empathy, and cultural exchange that few today even know existed. But how did these enemy soldiers end up thousands of miles from home? Who taught them to sing the very songs of the people they once tried to destroy? And what happened inside those wooden barracks that turned enemies into unlikely voices of reconciliation? This is the forgotten story of the POW camp where Germans learned to sing American folk songs, a story of war, captivity, and the music that bridged the unbridgeable. By the summer of 1944, the United States had become home to an invisible army, not of Americans, but of their enemies. More than 400,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across the country, held in hundreds of camps from Texas to Wisconsin. They built roads, picked fruit, harvested crops, and repaired railways, far from the war they'd once fought to win. One of those places was Camp Concordia, Kansas, a sprawling complex that could hold over 4,000 prisoners at a time. Wooden barracks stretched across the flat plains, framed by endless wheat fields and a sky so open it must have felt unreal to men who had grown up under blackout curtains and bomb sirens. To the locals, the arrival of these prisoners was unsettling. Kansas farmers had lost sons to the war. Now they watched trainloads of German soldiers, the very enemy, arriving under guard, yet treated with food, shelter, and even medical care. It was a paradox of war, enemies being fed by those they had sought to destroy. But Camp Concordia was not like the cold, brutal camps seen in Europe. The United States followed the Geneva Convention strictly. Prisoners were given decent rations, allowed letters from home, and even permitted organized recreation. For the American government, this wasn't just about morality. It was strategy. Military intelligence and the Office of War Information saw these camps as an opportunity, a chance to reshape the thinking of German soldiers, to plant the seeds of democracy, freedom, and tolerance through something more powerful than orders: ideas. At Concordia, officers handpicked by the Allies ran educational programs. Books, lectures, and even film screenings were introduced. German prisoners could attend classes on history, civics, and literature. Some camps even had libraries and newspapers, all in German, but curated to promote democratic thought. But one of the most unexpected tools turned out to be music. In the evenings, after work details, prisoners gathered to play instruments. Many were musicians before the war. Students, teachers, or members of small-town orchestras. They found scraps of wood to build violins, borrowed harmonicas from guards, and formed small choirs. What began as a way to fight boredom soon became something deeper. When they sang, they remembered life before the uniforms, their families, their towns, the feeling of being human again. American officers noticed. Some encouraged it, even joining in. Folk songs like "You Are My Sunshine" and "Home on the Range" started to circulate in the camp. The tunes were simple, the lyrics clear. They became a bridge, a way for guards and prisoners to share something beyond war. For many German prisoners, these songs carried a strange emotional weight. They spoke of freedom, love, and open land. The very things they'd been told to fight against in a propaganda-fueled Germany. Some began to keep notebooks of English words learned through songs. Others wrote home about the kindness of American guards. And little by little, the strict barriers of ideology began to soften. Not everyone approved. Within the camp, there were factions. Loyal Nazis who despised this American contamination. They threatened fellow prisoners who cooperated too much, labeling them traitors. But in a place where humanity had survived captivity, even fear began to lose its hold. By 1945, the world outside the barbed wire was changing rapidly. Germany was collapsing. The Allied advance was unstoppable. And at Camp Concordia, something extraordinary was about to unfold. An act of music and defiance that would turn this quiet camp into a symbol of reconciliation. Because soon, those same German soldiers would do something no one expected. They would sing not just for themselves, but for America. By early 1945, Camp Concordia had become more than a prison. It was a strange village, half German, half American, bound by fences, yet pulsing with life. Every morning began with roll call, the crisp sound of names once shouted across European battlefields, now echoing softly across the Kansas plains. Prisoners worked in the fields, helped nearby farmers, repaired equipment, and in return, they were paid small wages in camp currency. But what truly defined Concordia wasn't the work. It was what happened after sunset. Inside the barracks, after the guards made their rounds, men gathered with guitars, violins, and makeshift drums. They sang, at first old German ballads, songs of lost love, of forests and rivers far away. But gradually, something shifted. The Americans had begun organizing small cultural exchanges, lectures on democracy, movie nights showing life in the U.S., and simple English lessons using popular songs. It wasn't forced, it was offered. And many of the prisoners, weary and homesick, accepted. One of them was Wilhelm Krause, a former music teacher from Leipzig. Before the war, he had taught children in a village school, conducting small choirs. Now he was a prisoner, but not broken. When an American officer handed him a booklet of folk songs, American songs, Krause smiled for the first time in months. He gathered a few friends, a carpenter, a baker, a young soldier from Hamburg who played harmonica, and began to translate the lyrics. They didn't understand all the words, but they felt them. Home, home on the range. The melody was simple, but to men far from home, the word itself, home, was like a prayer. Night after night, their singing drew attention. Guards stopped outside the barracks, listening quietly. Some joined in, correcting their pronunciation, laughing when the Germans stumbled over phrases like, "where the deer and the antelope play." It wasn't just music anymore. It was communication. One note, one word, one moment of shared humanity at a time. But not everyone saw it that way. Inside the camp, a small group of hardline Nazi loyalists called themselves Die Schwarzen Adler, the Black Eagles. They despised any form of cooperation with the Americans. They still believed in Hitler's victory, even as news trickled in that Berlin was under siege. They spread fear through intimidation, graffiti, and whispered threats. When Krause's group performed in the camp courtyard one evening, a note was slipped under his barrack door that night. It read simply, "You sing their songs. You betray your country." He tore it up because by then, something irreversible had begun. Music was winning where politics had failed. The American officers saw the change too. Reports described prisoners who were once defiant, now calm and reflective. They began to speak of freedom, not as a propaganda word, but as a human one. Letters from home, if they arrived at all, painted a grim picture of Germany's destruction. The men inside Concordia began to understand that the world they'd fought for no longer existed. And so, when Christmas 1944 turned into the new year of 1945, the camp decided to hold a concert, half German, half American. It was unprecedented. The prisoners built a small stage using wooden planks. They hung paper stars and made decorations from ration boxes. The Americans provided a piano from the local church. When the night came, guards and prisoners sat side by side. The concert began with traditional German carols, Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, voices rich and trembling with nostalgia. Then Wilhelm Krause stepped forward. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the Americans in the crowd, and announced the next song in slow, careful English. "This is Song of Your Country." The piano began softly, and then, with thick accents and pure sincerity, dozens of German voices rose together. "Home, home on the range." The guards fell silent. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes. For a moment there were no fences, no uniforms, only men remembering what peace sounded like. That night became legend in Concordia, a prisoners' concert that turned enemies into neighbors, if only for an hour. But even as the songs faded, tension lingered. The Black Eagles saw the performance as betrayal. They began marking sympathizers' doors with chalk, spreading fear again. Yet this time, the camp refused to divide. Krause's group kept singing. They held classes, teaching others how to play American tunes. The camp newspaper began printing translated lyrics. Even the American officers noticed how morale improved. Discipline incidents dropped, and cooperation increased. One report to Washington summarized it simply: "Music has done what lectures could not." The power of melody had turned a camp of enemies into a choir of human beings rediscovering dignity. But the story didn't end there, because soon the war would end, and these same prisoners would be sent home. And what they carried back to Germany would change more than anyone expected. Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing. Hitler was dead, Berlin was in ruins, and for the prisoners at Camp Concordia, the sound of distant gunfire was replaced by the rustle of Kansas wind through wheat fields. The guards began to speak more openly. "It's almost over," one said. But the news landed differently for the men behind the wire. Freedom was coming. Yet none of them knew what kind of world waited beyond it. For many, going home meant returning to ashes. Their families were scattered, their cities bombed, their beliefs shattered. Some were terrified to return at all, afraid of how their neighbors would see them, afraid of what they themselves had become. And so as the final months passed, the men of Camp Concordia turned again to the only thing that gave them meaning: the music. Wilhelm Krause decided to organize one last concert, not as a gesture of defiance, but as a farewell. He called it Voices for Tomorrow. The Americans offered to help. The camp's chapel was cleared, benches arranged, and a small stage built from leftover lumber. This time the songs weren't chosen for propaganda or even for morale. They were chosen for peace. The first half of the program was German: folk songs and hymns of home, songs that spoke of rivers and mothers, of lost time and forgiveness. The audience, a mix of guards, townspeople, and prisoners, listened in reverent silence. Then Krause stood again before them. He looked older now, thin from years of rationing, but his eyes bright. He raised his hand for quiet. "This next song," he said slowly, "belongs to both sides." The piano began with hesitant notes. A few men strummed guitars, and then, like a prayer whispered into still air, they began to sing, in English, with thick but steady accents. "This land is your land. This land is my land." It was Woody Guthrie's anthem, a song written for a divided America. But in that camp, surrounded by fences and flags, it became something larger. The guards joined in, their voices rough and untrained. Some prisoners smiled through tears. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about the shared longing for belonging, for dignity, for peace. When the song ended, no one clapped. No one needed to. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. For a brief moment, the war, the hatred, the ideologies, the orders, all of it disappeared. What remained were men, stripped of everything but their humanity. bound by a song about freedom neither side fully possessed. After the concert, one American officer wrote in his diary, "I never thought I'd see the day when Germans sang about liberty in an American camp," and meant it. Within weeks, orders came down. The war in Europe was officially over. The prisoners were to be sent home. When the announcement spread through the camp, cheers and tears mixed. Some men fell to their knees. Others stood silent, uncertain. They packed their few belongings: letters, carvings, notebooks of lyrics written in 2 languages. Krause folded his sheet music neatly into a suitcase. Before leaving, he gave one final instruction to his choir: "Sing when you can. Wherever you are, sing what is true." As the trucks rolled out of Camp Concordia, the men began to hum softly. Not a German march, not a victory tune, but the same folk song they'd learned under Kansas skies. The same one that had once puzzled their guards. Home, home on the range. The melody drifted over the fields and faded into the distance, carried by the wind. That was how the Americans remembered them. Not as enemies, not as soldiers, but as voices singing their way back to a broken homeland. For the people of Concordia, it became a legend. Years later, old guards would tell their children about the Germans who sang American songs. And somewhere in post-war Germany, in the rubble and rebuilding, those same men taught others what they had learned behind barbed wire. That even in captivity, freedom can be found in a song. It was the quietest victory of the war, and perhaps the most human. When the war ended, most German prisoners were returned to Europe between late 1945 and 1946. Camp Concordia was dismantled. The barracks were sold, the watchtowers torn down, the fences rolled away. All that remained were the Kansas winds, the wheat fields, and the memory of songs once sung by those who came as enemies and left as something else. For years, their story went untold. America moved on. The world rebuilt. But traces of that strange chapter survived in letters, diaries, and oral histories. Some of the men who had sung under Krause's direction later wrote home about it. One remembered how the words of "Home on the Range" had stayed with him through his return to the ruins of Hamburg. He said it was the first song he taught his daughter after the war, because it reminded him not of captivity, but of kindness. Others carried more than memories. When post-war Germany began its slow transformation from dictatorship to democracy, many former POWs became teachers, musicians, journalists, men who had seen a different kind of freedom inside those camps. They spoke of guards who treated them fairly, of lectures about liberty and music that made them think. To them, Camp Concordia wasn't a place of punishment. It was a place of awakening. Historians later described this as America's quiet experiment in re-education. It wasn't perfect. Not every camp was as humane, not every prisoner was changed. But in Concordia, something worked. Something that couldn't be measured in reports or statistics. It was proof that culture could reach where weapons could not. And yet, the irony remained, that in the middle of a world war fought for survival, empathy had flourished inside a prison. That men who had marched for tyranny found freedom in the land of their captors, through songs about wide plains and open skies. Decades later, a small museum was built on the site of Camp Concordia. Visitors still come to see the photos of young German men holding guitars, smiling through the wire. Some of those smiles look awkward, uncertain, but real. In one photo, Wilhelm Krause stands in the center holding a baton. The caption reads simply, "Choir practice 1945, he would never see Kansas again." But his voice, and the voices of his men, echoed far beyond that camp. Because the story of Camp Concordia isn't just about war or peace. It's about what happens when understanding replaces hatred, when a melody crosses a boundary that barbed wire cannot. History remembers great battles and famous generals, but sometimes the smallest moments, a song, a word, a shared silence, reveal a victory far greater than conquest. And so, when the last note of "Home on the Range" faded into the Kansas wind, the world had already begun to change. Quietly, irrevocably. In the silence that followed, the earth remembered everything.